Helena Whitmore laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a polite laugh. A slow, deliberate laugh, the kind designed to land like a slap. She looked Daniel Brooks up and down across the boardroom table, took in his 6-year-old suit, his simple folder, his 8-year-old daughter sitting quietly beside him, and she laughed like the entire situation was the punchline to a joke she hadn't even needed to tell. Then she leaned forward. "Let me be honest with you," she said, her voice smooth and sharp, at the same time the voice of a woman who had never once in her life been told to lower it. "I don't know who let you into this room, but you don't belong here." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink, didn't say a single word. He picked up his daughter's hand, stood up, and walked out. 48 hours later, 42 banks across America froze every transaction connected to Helena Whitmore's billion-dollar empire simultaneously. And every freeze order carried the same name. His. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, because what happened next will change the way you think about who has real power in this world. The morning started the way all of Daniel Brooks's mornings started, with his daughter's voice. "Daddy, does my hair look okay?" Amara was 8 years old, standing in the bathroom doorway of their apartment on the south side of Chicago, wearing her school uniform and holding a yellow beret in her small hand. She had her mother's eyes wide brown, searching, and when she looked at Daniel like that, asking the simplest question in the world, he felt everything at once. Pride, pain, gratitude. A grief so old, it had become part of his breathing. "You look perfect," he said. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." She rolled her eyes the way only 8-year-olds can. Theatrical, dramatic, unconvinced, and handed him the beret. He clipped it into her braids with the careful concentration of a man who had learned to do this, not from instinct, but from necessity. From love. From 3 years of YouTube tutorials and patient Saturday mornings, and Amara's gentle corrections when he got it wrong. "Not like that, Daddy. Like this." He got it right on the first try that morning. She didn't say anything, but she checked herself in the hallway mirror and gave a small nod of approval. That nod, that single quiet nod from his 8-year-old daughter, was worth more to Daniel Brooks than any meeting he had ever walked into. And he had walked into some important meetings. People who knew his name in the financial world. The people who actually understood what his company, BrooksShield Technologies, had built, described him in language that made investors uncomfortable. Not because anything was wrong, but because the truth about Daniel Brooks didn't fit neatly into the story people expected when they heard billion-dollar financial security technology. They expected someone from MIT, someone who had raised venture capital at 23, someone who wore the right clothes and spoke the right language and belonged to the right clubs. They didn't expect a 35-year-old black man from the south side of Chicago who wore a suit he had purchased 6 years ago and repaired twice since then. Who drove a 2014 Honda Accord with one window that stuck in cold weather. Who packed his daughter's lunch every morning and picked her up every afternoon from the after-school program at Martin Luther King Elementary. Who had built quietly and without fanfare a financial security system so sophisticated, so deeply trusted, and so fundamentally woven into the operating infrastructure of 42 regional banks across the United States that removing it would not just be difficult, it would be catastrophic. Daniel hadn't built BrooksShield to get rich. He had built it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. He and Amara took the bus that morning. It was faster than driving downtown, and parking near the Whitmore Capital Group building would have cost $20 that Daniel preferred to keep in his wallet. This was the kind of he still made not, because BrooksShield hadn't generated revenue, but because Daniel Brooks had never learned to spend money on things that didn't matter. His mother had raised him that way. Necessity had reinforced it, and 3 years of being a single father had turned frugality into something close to a spiritual practice. On the bus, Amara pressed her forehead against the window and watched the city go by. "What's the meeting about?" she asked. "Business." "What kind of business?" "The kind where grown-ups talk a lot and say almost nothing." She thought about that. "Is it important?" Daniel looked at the envelope on his lap. The invitation from Whitmore Capital Group. Heavy cream, embossed letterhead, the kind of stationery designed to communicate power before a single word was read. He had received it 11 days ago. He had read it 4 times. He had spent 3 evenings reviewing every public record, every SEC filing, every news article he could find about Helena Whitmore and the empire she had built. He had done his homework. He always did his homework. It could be, he told Amara honestly, it could change a lot of things. Good things or scary things. Hopefully good things, but sometimes they're the same. She accepted this with the seriousness of someone 3 times her age and went back to watching the city. BrooksShield Technologies had not arrived at this moment by accident. Daniel had spent 11 years building it, first in the 2nd bedroom of a 2-bedroom apartment, then in a small leased office in Pilsen, then in a proper space on the west side of downtown Chicago, with 18 employees and a server infrastructure that hummed 24 hours a day, protecting the accounts of ordinary Americans who would never know his name. He had started after watching his aunt lose her savings account to an automated fraud scheme that her bank had not caught in time. $3,000, her entire emergency fund, gone in 48 hours, while her bank's security system sent her 2 emails she didn't open in time. Daniel had looked at the system that had failed her and thought, I can build something better than this. He was 24 years old. He had a computer science degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago and 2 years of experience at a mid-sized software company where he had written security algorithms that his supervisors had praised and then quietly absorbed into projects with other people's names on them. He had no investors, no safety net, no famous connections. What he had was time, a second-hand server rack, and a specific burning anger at systems that were built to protect wealth rather than people. He worked nights for 2 years. Then he worked nights and weekends. He cold-called regional banks. He offered them 30-day free trials of a fraud detection system that in those 30 days caught threats their existing systems had completely missed. He didn't charge them anything until they saw the results. He didn't ask for anything except the chance to prove what his technology could do. By the time Daniel was 29, BrooksShield had 12 banking clients. By the time he was 32, that number was 27. By the time he received Helena Whitmore's invitation, 42 banks across 11 states had embedded BrooksShield's technology so deeply into their operating infrastructure that their compliance officers referenced it in regulatory filings. Their cybersecurity teams trained with it. Their fraud departments depended on it the way a surgeon depends on instruments, not as tools they occasionally reached for, but as extensions of their own professional judgment. And every single one of those institutions trusted Daniel Brooks personally. Not just his technology, him. Because in 11 years, Daniel Brooks had never broken a promise to a client. He had personally called bank executives at 2 in the morning when his system detected a threat. He had driven to regional offices in Indiana and Ohio and Wisconsin to walk compliance teams through new features at no extra charge. He had reduced fees for 3 community banks that were struggling financially because he believed in what they were doing for their communities, and he didn't want money to be the reason they had to give up good security. The man was a vault of credibility, and not one person in the Whitmore Capital Group building knew it when he walked through their doors that morning. The lobby was exactly what Daniel had expected. Marble floors, 30-foot ceilings. A reception desk staffed by 2 young professionals whose job he understood was not just to direct visitors, but to make them feel smaller by comparison. Abstract art on the walls that cost more than Daniel's apartment building. The faint, deliberate scent of money leather and cool air, and the subtle suggestion that everyone in this space had earned their right to be here through means that you visitor had probably not achieved. Daniel had grown up poor enough to recognize a room designed to intimidate. He wasn't intimidated. He had been in too many rooms that looked like this, rooms where the presentation of power had become a substitute for actual substance, to feel anything except mildly curious about what was behind the theater. He checked Amara in at the front desk and asked the receptionist if there was a place where his daughter could sit comfortably during the meeting. The young woman blinked clearly, not a request she received often, and arranged for Amara to wait in a small conference room with a tablet, a glass of orange juice, and what looked like a plate of expensive cookies. Amara assessed the cookies with the gravity of a professional food critic and deemed them acceptable. Daniel kissed the top of her head. I'll be back in an hour. If it runs long, it's okay, he said, already reaching for a cookie. These are good. He laughed, actually laughed for the first time that morning, and walked into the elevator. The boardroom on the 41st floor was full when Daniel arrived. 8 executives sat along a table that had probably cost more than Daniel's car. Financial projections glowed on a presentation screen at the far end of the room. There was a pitcher of water, a bowl of fruit, and a level of ambient professional tension that Daniel recognized immediately, the specific kind of tightness that fills a room when everyone is waiting for a superior to arrive and set the emotional temperature. He introduced himself to the room. Handshakes. Professional smiles. A few of the executives looked at him with a flicker of something surprise recalibration. The microscopic adjustment people make when reality doesn't match the picture they had assembled in advance. Daniel had seen that look before. He had seen it all his life. He was used to it. He simply smiled, sat down, and opened his folder. He was reviewing his notes when Helena Whitmore walked in, and then the temperature in the room changed entirely. She entered the way people enter rooms when they believe the room was designed around them. She was 32 years old, tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that had certainly been tailored rather than purchased off a rack. Her hair was pulled back in a style that communicated precision. She had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no in a way that actually mattered, not because she had never faced challenges, but because the particular machinery of her world had a habit of eventually saying yes to people who looked like Helena Whitmore. She sat at the head of the table. She glanced around the room. Her eyes landed on Daniel, and they stopped. He watched her process him. He could see it happening, the quick, practiced inventory that powerful people perform on those they consider beneath them. The suit, the watch, the folder instead of a laptop. The absence of the usual markers that her world used to assign value to a person before they had said a single word. He watched her decide, and then she spoke. "You're Daniel Brooks." Her tone carried something that was not quite skepticism. It was more pointed than that. It was the specific inflection of someone who had already arrived at a conclusion and was confirming it rather than asking. "Yes," Daniel said. "Thank you for the invitation. I've looked forward to..." "You drove here." The question landed strangely. Non sequitur. Off rhythm. Daniel paused. "I took the bus, actually." One of the executives shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The bus," Helena repeated, not as a question, as an observation being recorded and filed under a category she had already created. "My company," Daniel said calmly, redirecting, because he had been in enough rooms to know when someone was trying to set a frame, and he had no interest in accepting this one, has provided financial security services to 42 banking institutions across 11 states. Our fraud detection rate over the past fiscal year was... Let me ask you something, Mr. Brooks." Helena leaned back in her chair in the manner of someone who has decided the meeting's agenda is now hers to control. "How long have you been in business?" 11 years. "And you're still operating out of Chicago?" "We are." "Single location, single founder." She glanced at her executives as though sharing a private observation. "What's your current valuation?" "I'd prefer to walk through our..." "Because I'm looking at your folder," she said, and her voice carried the first clear edge now, a brightness that was not warmth. "And I'm not seeing a deck. I'm not seeing a prospectus. I'm not seeing anything that looks like preparation for a meeting at this level." She paused. "Is this your first acquisition conversation?" Daniel held her gaze. "No. It looks like it might be." The room was quiet enough that Daniel could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. He set his pen down on the table with the deliberate calm of a man who has rehearsed this particular kind of patience so many times that it no longer requires effort. He looked at Helena. Whitmore really looked at her and took a moment that he knew she would interpret as hesitation, and that was in fact the opposite, a choice. A decision made in full clarity about what he was willing to do next. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "I think there may be a misunderstanding about why I'm here. I didn't come to this meeting because I need your company. I came because your team reached out to mine and suggested that a partnership could be mutually beneficial." He paused. "I'm still open to that conversation, but I want to make sure we're having it on honest terms. Something shifted in the room. It was small. A few bodies moving fractionally in their chairs, a collective micro-adjustment. But Daniel felt it. Two of the executives exchanged a glance so brief it was almost nothing. Helena's expression didn't change, but her voice did just slightly. A degree colder. Honest terms, she said. All right. Honestly, I've looked at BrooksShield. I've had my team review your contracts, your client list, your architecture. And honestly, Mr. Brooks, what I see is a regional provider. A good one maybe for what it is. But regional, limited, the kind of operation that works perfectly fine. She let the next phrase arrive with careful deliberation. For smaller institutions that can't afford better. The 42 banks we serve, Daniel said, include 4 of the 15 largest regional banks in the Midwest. Regional, she repeated, as though the word itself was the argument. With a combined asset base of over $300 billion. Silence. Our fraud prevention saved those institutions. Daniel continued his voice, still patient, still utterly without aggression, because he had learned over 11 years of building something in a world that underestimated him. Him that calm was not weakness. Calm was the most powerful thing he owned. An estimated $840 million in the last 24 months alone. He opened his folder, slid a single document across the table. I didn't bring a deck, Ms. Whitmore. I brought the actual numbers. Nobody picked up the document. They were waiting to see what Helena would do. She looked at it for one moment. Then looked back at him. You brought your daughter to a business meeting. Daniel felt something move through him. Not anger, not exactly. Something older and more composed than anger. The thing you feel when you have been underestimated so many times that the experience has become information rather than injury. My daughter goes where I go, he said simply. She always has. That's not going to change for a meeting. That's... Helena tilted her head slightly. That's a choice. It is, Daniel said. Not a particularly professional one. The word professional landed in the room with a weight she had clearly intended. And the weight was not about his daughter. Daniel understood this with absolute clarity. The weight was about him. It was a summary. A verdict delivered in one carefully chosen syllable. The suit. The bus. The folder. The daughter. The south side of Chicago. The absence of the right signifiers. All of it collapsed into a single word that was meant to close the conversation. Professional. Daniel picked up the document he had placed in front of her, returned it to his folder, and closed it with a soft, precise snap. He stood up. Thank you for your time, he said. He looked around the room. He made eye contact with 2 of the executives, the ones who had exchanged that glance, and held it for exactly long enough that they would remember it later. Then he picked up his folder, pushed his chair in with the same deliberate care with which he had placed his pen, and walked toward the door. Mr. Brooks. Helena's voice stopped him at the threshold. Her tone had shifted again, not warmer, but curious in a predatory way. The curiosity of someone who wants to see what the animal does when it reaches the edge of the enclosure. You're walking away from a significant offer. Daniel turned. You haven't made an offer, he said. You've made an assessment. He paused. They're not the same thing. He walked out. The elevator doors opened immediately, as if they had been waiting for him. He stepped inside. As the doors closed behind him, he caught a brief reflection of himself in the polished metal, an ordinary-looking man in a 6-year-old suit, carrying a simple leather folder standing very still. He didn't look like someone who had just won anything. That was fine. He never had. He found Amara on her 4th cookie. How'd it go? She asked without looking up from the tablet. It went, Daniel said. She looked at him then. She had his stillness. She had inherited it somewhere between his example and necessity, and she read him the way children read the parents who are their entire world. Was she mean? Amara asked. Daniel sat down next to her. She made some choices, he said carefully, about what she thought she was seeing. Amara chewed her cookie thoughtfully. Did she know who you were? I thought about that. The document he had slid across the table. The numbers Helena had not picked up, the 42 banks, $840 million. $300 billion in assets. The 11 years of 2 a.m. phone calls, and free consultations, and reduced fees, and personal commitments that had built something so solid, so trusted, so fundamentally load-bearing in the architecture of American regional banking, that the idea of it being dismissed as regional by a woman in a tailored suit was not an insult exactly. It was a gap. A profound and soon-to-be consequential gap between what Helena Whitmore believed she knew and what was actually true. "No," Daniel said. "She didn't." Amara nodded slowly. "Are you sad?" He thought about it honestly. He thought about the room on the 41st floor, and the executives who had looked uncomfortable, and the ventilation system in the ceiling, and the sound his folder had made when he closed it. "No," he said. "I'm not sad." And he meant it. Because Daniel Brooks had spent his entire professional life being underestimated. He had built an empire, a quiet, invisible, load-bearing empire, in the spaces where people like Helena Whitmore weren't looking. He had planted 42 roots so deep, so trusted, so intricately woven into the daily operations of institutions that served millions of ordinary Americans that pulling on any single thread of what he had built would cause something to move. He just didn't know yet what was already moving. He took Amara's hand. They walked to the elevator, and somewhere in the BrooksShield servers humming quietly in a West Side Chicago office that was decidedly not housed in a 41-story skyscraper, an automated compliance review had already begun. Because that was what the system did. That was what he had built it to do. It watched. It learned. It protected. And it had just noticed something about Whitmore Capital Group that it did not like at all. The bus ride home was quiet. Amara had fallen asleep against Daniel's shoulder, somewhere between Michigan Avenue and 35th Street, her yellow beret pressing gently against his jacket sleeve. Her breathing slow and even in the way children breathe when the world hasn't yet taught them to carry their sleep lightly. Daniel kept his arm around her and watched the city pass outside the window and didn't think about Helena Whitmore. He thought about his mother instead. I thought about the way she used to say, standing in the kitchen of their 2-bedroom apartment on South Halsted, stirring whatever was on the stove, not looking at him, but meaning every word. "Daniel, the loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one." He hadn't understood that when he was 12. He understood it now. He shifted Amara's weight gently so her neck wouldn't stiffen, and he looked down at his phone. 3 emails. 2 from his operations director, Marcus Webb. 1 from his head of compliance, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had a PhD in financial systems architecture from Carnegie Mellon, and who communicated exclusively in sentences that were precise to the point of feeling surgical. The email from Patricia had a subject line that read, "FYI routine flag WCG file. Nothing urgent. Talk when you're back." Daniel read it twice. Patricia Osei had been with BrooksShield for 7 years. In those 7 years, she had sent Daniel exactly 3 emails with the phrase, "nothing urgent" in them. And in each of those 3 cases, what followed had turned out to be in fact quite urgent. Patricia's definition of nothing urgent was calibrated to a frequency that most people could not hear. Daniel typed back, "I'll be there in 40 minutes." He looked out the window again. The city moved past him, indifferent and enormous, full of its usual Monday momentum taxis and delivery trucks and pedestrians in headphones, and the particular restless energy of a city that did not slow down for anyone's private reckoning. The Whitmore Capital Group building was already 5 miles behind him, already shrinking in the geography of the day, but Daniel could still feel the shape of that boardroom on his skin, the way you feel a room's temperature after you've left it. I wasn't angry. He needed to be clear about that. Not for anyone else's benefit, but for his own. Anger was a thing he had learned to examine carefully, to hold up to the light before he let it drive anything. He had learned this young, and he had learned it the hard way, in the specific way that black men in America learn to examine their own anger, not because it isn't justified, but because the cost of expressing it in the wrong room to the wrong person in the wrong moment is almost never paid by anyone except you. What he felt was something colder and more useful than anger. He felt clarity. Helena Whitmore had looked at him and decided in the span of approximately 90 seconds that she already knew everything worth knowing about Daniel Brooks. She had looked at his suit and seen poverty. She had looked at his folder and seen unpreparedness. She had looked at his daughter and seen unprofessionalism. She had assembled these observations into a verdict so quickly, so confidently, and with such absolute assurance that she was right, that she had not once considered the possibility that she was looking at evidence she didn't know how to read. That was fine. Daniel had spent his entire career being the thing that people didn't know how to read. He had learned a long time ago that the gap between what people assumed about him and what was actually true was not a liability. It was an asset. He kissed the top of Amara's head gently without waking her. The bus turned south. Marcus Webb was standing in the doorway of the BrooksShield offices when Daniel arrived, which was Marcus's version of alarm. Under ordinary circumstances, Marcus operated from his desk, with the calm-rooted energy of a man who had decided years ago that most things could be handled without standing up. He was 41 years old, built like a former linebacker, which he was 2 seasons at Northern Illinois, before a knee injury redirected his life toward computer science, and he had been Daniel's first hire, his closest professional confidant, and on the specific occasions when Daniel needed someone to tell him an uncomfortable truth, his most reliable source of exactly that. When Marcus was standing in a doorway, something was happening. "Patricia's in the server room," Marcus said, before Daniel had fully crossed the threshold. "What did she find? She wants to tell you herself." Daniel handed Marcus his jacket. "How long has she been in there?" "Since about 11:30. Daniel checked his watch. It was 2:17 in the afternoon. He found a chair for Amara in the break room, got her settled with her tablet, and a snack told her he'd be 20 minutes, and walked to the server room at the back of the office. The server room at BrooksShield was not large by industry standards. It was cool and loud in the specific way server rooms are loud, a constant layered hum that you stopped hearing. After about a minute, the way you stopped hearing your own heartbeat, and it smelled faintly of recycled air and electrical warmth. Patricia Osei was seated at a monitoring station in the corner, both hands on a keyboard, 3 screens open in front of her, and she had the look on her face that Daniel had come to recognize over 7 years as her version of deeply troubled. Patricia was 53 years old. She had short natural hair going silver at the temples, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a professional manner so composed that new employees sometimes spent their first month working alongside her before they understood that her quietness was not aloofness. It was the specific composure of a woman who had spent 30 years being the most qualified person in rooms that repeatedly acted surprised by this fact, and who had made a private decision at some point to let her work speak in the voice she was tired of having to use herself. She looked up when Daniel came in. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. "The routine compliance sweep on Whitmore Capital Group," she said, turning back to her screens. "The one that runs automatically on any entity that initiates acquisition contact with us. Standard protocol." "Right." It flagged something. Daniel pulled a chair next to her and sat down. "What kind of something?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how to say something that was complicated. "The kind of something," she said finally, "that I want to make sure I'm reading correctly before I use any of the words I'm currently thinking." That was the most alarmed Daniel had ever heard Patricia Osei sound. "Walk me through it," he said. She pulled up the first screen. "BrooksShield runs compliance cross-referencing on all entities in our network. Standard practice. We look at transaction patterns, regulatory filings, inter-institutional relationships. The system is designed to catch anomalies that human reviewers might miss because they're looking at data sequentially rather than relationally." She paused. "You know all of this." "I do. What you may not know," she said, "is that over the past 8 months, our system has been flagging a pattern in the transaction flows touching 7 of our client banks. Not large enough to trigger external reporting requirements. Not obviously connected if you're looking at each institution individually." She pulled up a second screen, a network diagram, with lines connecting what looked like dozens of financial entities. "But our system doesn't look at institutions individually." Daniel leaned forward. The diagram on the screen was complex nodes and connection lines and data labels in a visual language that Daniel had designed himself years ago, based on the specific insight that financial fraud rarely happened in a single institution. It happened in the relationships between institutions, in the gaps, in the spaces where one bank's compliance team handed off to another bank's compliance team, and nobody was watching the handoff. These 7 banks, Patricia said, pointing to a cluster of highlighted nodes on the diagram. All regional, all BrooksShield clients, all showing similar anomalies in their correspondent banking relationships over the same 8-month period. What kind of anomalies? Transaction layering, she said. Very sophisticated. The kind that's designed to look like normal commercial activity if you're examining it at the level of any single institution. She paused. But when you look at the aggregate pattern across all 7 banks simultaneously, she switched to the 3rd screen. You see something that looks a lot like a structured effort to move significant capital through correspondent banking channels in a way that obscures the ultimate origin and destination. The room hummed around them. Daniel looked at the screen for a long moment. How significant? Conservative estimate based on what we can see. Patricia took her glasses off her forehead and put them on. Somewhere between $80 and $120 million, over 8 months. And the entity at the center of the pattern. Patricia turned and looked at him directly over the rims of her glasses. Whitmore Capital Group, she said. The server room hummed. Daniel sat very still. He thought about the boardroom on the 41st floor, the tailored suit, the dismissive laugh, the word professional arriving in the room like a verdict, the document he had slid across the table that Helena Whitmore had not picked up. He thought about Patricia's email. Nothing urgent. How certain are you? He asked. I'm certain enough, Patricia said, that I've spent the last 2.5 hours trying to find an alternative explanation, and I haven't found one. She pulled off her glasses and set them on the desk. Daniel, our system doesn't speculate. It identifies patterns and assigns confidence levels. The confidence level on this flag is 91%. 91. In 7 years, I have never seen it above 88 on a pattern that turned out to be innocent noise. Daniel stood up, walked to the far wall of the server room, turned around, walked back, sat down. This was his version of pacing measured, contained, economical. Marcus had once described it as what Daniel does when he's doing the most thinking. What's our obligation? He asked. Legally, right now. What are we required to do? Under our contracts with the 7 affected client banks, Patricia said, we are required to report a flag of this confidence level to their compliance officers within 72 hours of identification. She paused. I identified it at 11:47 this morning. So the clock started at 11:47. Yes. Daniel looked at the network diagram on the screen. 42 nodes. 42 banks. 42 relationships built over 11 years of 2 a.m. phone calls and reduced fees and personal commitments, and trust accumulated. The way trust actually accumulates, not through contracts, not through marketing, not through the performance of power in a tailored suit on the 41st floor of a skyscraper, but through consistency, through showing up, through doing what you said you would do every time, including the times when nobody was watching, and nobody would have known if you hadn't. Draft the notification, Daniel said. Standard protocol, all 7 compliance officers, 72-hour window. Patricia nodded once, already reaching for her keyboard. And Patricia. She looked up. Do it right, he said. Exactly right. No editorializing. No conclusions beyond what the data shows. Just the pattern, the confidence level, and the supporting documentation. That's how I always do it, she said. I know, he said. I just wanted to say it out loud. He walked out of the server room. He did not call a lawyer that afternoon. He did not call a journalist. He did not call any of the 42 banking relationships in his network. He did not reach out to any of the financial industry contacts he had accumulated over 11 years who would have received this information with the particular excitement of people who believed that one powerful entity's misfortune was another's opportunity. I went to the break room, sat next to his daughter, helped her with the math homework she had pulled out of her backpack, and made them both grilled cheese sandwiches on the office kitchen's ancient 2-burner stove. You're thinking about something, Amara said, not looking up from her worksheet. I'm thinking about your math. No, you're not. You're thinking about the meeting. He flipped the sandwich. How do you know? Because when you're thinking about my math, you make the face like you're trying to remember something. When you're thinking about work stuff, you make the face like you already know the answer, but you're waiting for something to catch up. Daniel looked at his daughter. When did you get so observant? He asked. She shrugged. I've always been observant. You just don't always notice. He slid the sandwich onto a plate and set it in front of her. The woman from the meeting, he said carefully, made some choices today that are going to have consequences. Not because of anything I did, because of what our system found. Amara took a bite. Is she in trouble? I don't know yet. Maybe. Did she do something wrong? It looks that way. We don't know for certain. Amara chewed thoughtfully. Are you going to help her? The question landed in Daniel's chest in an unexpected place. He stood at the stove for a moment and examined it honestly. My job right now, he said, is to do what I'm required to do, what the contract says, what the law requires. He paused. Which is to tell the people who need to know what we found. And then, he said, we see what happens. Amara looked at him with those wide brown eyes, her mother's eyes, and nodded slowly. The nod of someone who understood that adults sometimes had to live in the space between doing what was right and knowing what would come next, and who had enough trust in this particular adult to believe that he would navigate that space with care. Okay, she said, and went back to her math. Patricia Osei sent the compliance notifications at 6:43 that evening. 7 emails. 7 compliance officers at 7 regional banks across 5 states. Each one containing BrooksShield standard, anomaly report format, the pattern identification, the confidence level, the supporting transaction data, the network diagram, and the formal notification that under the terms of BrooksShield service agreement, the company was fulfilling its contractual obligation to report suspicious activity patterns to affected client institutions. Each email ended with Patricia's direct line and Daniel's contact information and the offer standard in every BrooksShield communication to walk the compliance team through the data in a call at whatever time was convenient. The first response came back in 11 minutes. It was from the Chief Compliance Officer at Heartland Federal Savings, a mid-sized regional bank in Columbus, Ohio, that had been a BrooksShield client for 6 years. His name was Robert Finch, and in 6 years, Daniel had spoken with him personally on 14 separate occasions, including once at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when BrooksShield's system had caught a coordinated phishing campaign targeting Heartland's commercial accounts, and Daniel had called Robert directly, rather than waiting for the automated alert to work its way through the bank's internal routing. Robert Finch's reply was 3 sentences long. Patricia received and reviewing. Escalating to our legal and risk teams immediately. Please let Daniel know we're taking this seriously. The second response came 23 minutes later. Then a third. By 9 o'clock that evening, 5 of the 7 compliance officers had responded. By midnight, all 7 had. The language varied. The speed varied. But the substance was the same across all 7 responses. They were taking it seriously. They were escalating. They needed to talk. Daniel read each response from his living room couch. Amara long since asleep in her room. The apartment quiet around him. In the way apartments are quiet late at night when the city has finally reluctantly partially surrendered its noise. He read each email carefully. He drafted Patricia's replies with her by phone, walking through how to respond to each compliance officer's specific questions and concerns. He did not feel triumphant. He needed to be clear about that too, not for anyone else's benefit, but for his own. There was nothing triumphant about this. A woman had treated him with contempt in a boardroom that morning. And what was unfolding now was not revenge. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't the universe correcting an injustice with the satisfying narrative tidiness that stories often provided and real life almost never did. What it was a system doing what it was designed to do. A system he had built to protect ordinary people from sophisticated financial predation. A system he had built because of his aunt's $3,000, because of every small community bank that couldn't afford the security solutions that large institutions took for granted, because of every family that had lost savings they couldn't recover to fraud. That better technology would have caught that system, had found something. And it was doing what it was designed to do. Whether Helena Whitmore had been rude to Daniel Brooks in a boardroom that morning was entirely beside the point. He lay back on the couch and stared at the ceiling and thought about that. The integrity of what he was doing depended on him believing it, not just saying it, not just performing the right professional posture, but actually genuinely believing that the compliance notification Patricia had sent would have been identical, regardless of what had happened on the 41st floor of the Whitmore Capitol building earlier that day. He held the question honestly. He believed it. He was certain he believed it. He fell asleep on this couch around 1 a.m., with his phone on his chest. The apartment quiet, the city still humming outside the windows with its bottomless and indifferent energy. He didn't know that in 8 hours, Robert Finch at Heartland Federal Savings would walk into an emergency risk management meeting and present BrooksShield's findings to a room that included Heartland's CEO, their general counsel, and 3 members of their board. I didn't know that 2 of the other compliance officers had already made similar calls to their own leadership. He didn't know that by 7 a.m. the next morning, 3 separate legal teams at 3 separate banking institutions would be on calls with their regulatory contacts at the Federal Reserve and the OCC. And he certainly didn't know that by 10 a.m. on Tuesday, while he was dropping Amara off at school, while he was buying 2 coffees from the place on 43rd Street, where the owner knew his order while he was walking the 4 blocks from the coffee shop to the BrooksShield office, with the November air cold and sharp against his face. Helena Whitmore's chief financial officer would be standing at her desk, telling her that something had happened. Something significant. Something she needed to know about immediately. Helena Whitmore did not take bad news well. This was not a secret within Whitmore Capital Group. It was an understood feature of the professional landscape, like the fact that the elevators on the east side of the building were slower, or that the coffee on the 3rd floor was better than the coffee on the 32nd. A condition of the environment that everyone who worked there had made their private accommodation to. You brought Helena bad news only when you had already exhausted every possibility that it wasn't bad news. You brought it with documentation. You brought it with a proposed solution already prepared. And you did not under any circumstances bring it in a group, because Helena's response to bad news in front of an audience was something that people who had witnessed it did not describe without a particular careful restraint in their word choice. Her CFO, a man named Warren Cross, who had been with the company for 9 years, and who had developed over those 9 years a nearly clinical ability to deliver difficult information with the flat, inflectionless precision of a person. A person reading coordinates knocked on her office door at 10:17 Tuesday morning and said 4 words. "We have a problem." Helena looked up from her desk. She read Warren's face. She was good at reading Warren's face because Warren's face was under ordinary circumstances exceptionally difficult to read, and she felt something in her chest shift. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. "Tell me." 7 of our correspondent banking partners, Warren said, received anomaly reports this morning from their financial security provider. The reports flag a pattern of suspicious transaction activity involving Whitmore Capital Group accounts over the past 8 months. He paused. The reports were generated by BrooksShield Technologies. Helena was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "BrooksShield," she said. "Yes." "Daniel Brooks's company." "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window. Her office had floor-to-ceiling windows facing north. The city laid out below her in the gray November light, and she stood there with her back to Warren and her arms crossed, and she was quiet for long enough that Warren, who had learned to read Helena's silences the way sailors learn to read weather, felt the specific quality of this one and decided not to speak. "What's in the reports?" she asked. "Transaction layering patterns, correspondent banking channels, over an 8-month period." Warren paused. "The confidence level they're citing is 91%. That's their number. What does it actually mean?" "It means their system is 91% certain. The pattern it identified is not normal commercial activity." He paused again. "Our legal team is reviewing the specifics. But the preliminary read is that whatever the underlying reality is, the pattern as described in these reports will trigger mandatory review protocols at each of the 7 banks." Which means that until the reviews are complete, some of those institutions may suspend or restrict transaction activity connected to accounts flagged in the report. He said the next sentence without inflection, in the way that a person delivers information that they know will land badly and have made peace with. We're already seeing preliminary holds on 2 correspondent accounts as of this morning. Helena turned from the window. She looked at Warren Cross for a long moment. This came from BrooksShield, she said again. Not a question. Processing. Yes. The same company that... Yes. Yesterday. Yes. She sat back down at her desk. She folded her hands on the surface in front of her, a gesture so controlled that it looked rehearsed, and she looked at the far wall of her office, and she was quiet for a very long time. Warren waited. "Get me our general counsel," she said. "Get me our head of regulatory affairs. And get me the compliance reports, all of them, every transaction they're flagging, every data point." She paused. "And Warren." "Yes. Find out everything there is to know about Daniel Brooks." It took Warren Cross the rest of that Tuesday to compile what Helena had asked for. By Wednesday morning, he had a file. It was not the file he had expected to assemble. He had expected, when Helena gave the instruction to find a regional tech operator with a modestly successful niche product and a client list that was respectable but not remarkable. He had expected the kind of background that would allow Helena and her legal team and her communications team to frame BrooksShield's compliance notification as the overreach of a small, unsophisticated operator with a conflict of interest related to the previous day's meeting. What he found instead was something that made Warren Cross, who prided himself on professional imperturbability, sit at his desk for almost 10 minutes before he picked up the phone. He found 11 years of documented client relationships, each one characterized by the same pattern. A banking institution brings in BrooksShield. BrooksShield's system identifies threats that the bank's existing infrastructure had missed. BrooksShield reports those threats through proper channels. The threats are resolved, and the banking institution deepens its relationship with BrooksShield as a result. He found 42 current clients, including 4 of the 15 largest regional banks in the Midwest, with a combined asset base of over $300 billion. He found across 11 years and 42 clients exactly 0 instances of BrooksShield's compliance reporting being found to be in error by regulatory review. 0. Not low. Not a small percentage that could be rounded down to negligible. 0. He found personal testimonials from bank executives across 11 states that described Daniel Brooks in language that Warren recognized not from the business world exactly, but from something older than that. The language people used when they were trying to describe a quality in another person that they hadn't encountered very often and weren't sure they had quite the right vocabulary for. "The most trustworthy vendor relationship I've had in 30 years of banking," said the CEO of First Consolidated in Des Moines. "Daniel Brooks has called me personally in the middle of the night to protect our customers," said the chief risk officer at Great Lakes Community Bank. "Twice. He didn't bill us for either call. When we were going through a difficult period financially, BrooksShield reduced their service fees for 18 months without being asked," said the compliance director at Southern Cross Federal Savings. "They said they believed in what we were doing for our community. In 20 years of vendor relationships, I have never experienced anything remotely like that." Warren read through the file. Then he read through it again. Then he picked up the phone and called Helena's office and asked if he could have 30 minutes that afternoon. He had the specific quality of careful professional dread that a person develops when they are about to tell someone something they do not want to hear about a situation that they have realized too late, but clearly is significantly worse than initially understood. Helena listened to Warren's summary without interrupting. This was in itself a sign that something had shifted. Helena interrupted constantly efficiently as a tool of information gathering. She asked questions in the middle of presentations, not to disrupt them, but to triangulate faster, to compress the time between receiving information and forming a position on it. The fact that she sat quietly through Warren's entire presentation, hands folded, expression unreadable, told Warren more than anything she could have said. "So," she said when he finished. "So," Warren said. The man I dismissed yesterday afternoon as a small regional operator with no particular relevance to our world. Yes. Is in fact the person whose technology is embedded in the operating infrastructure of 42 banking institutions, including several institutions whose correspondent relationships we depend on. Yes. Whose compliance reporting has a perfect track record across 11 years. Yes. And whose system identified with a 91% confidence level a pattern of activity in our transaction history that is now triggering mandatory review protocols at 7 of those institutions. Yes, Warren said. That is an accurate summary. Helena was quiet. Warren Cross had worked for Helena Whitmore for 9 years. He had watched her navigate hostile acquisitions, regulatory investigations, market downturns, board challenges, and the specific kind of crisis that comes when a company's public narrative and its private reality have drifted too far apart for the gap to remain invisible. He had seen her make brilliant decisions. He had seen her make decisions that were not brilliant. He had watched her in each case respond to difficulty with the specific energy of a person who experienced obstacles primarily as arguments to be won. This was different. He could see it happening whatever it was. A recalibration. Something fundamental and uncomfortable moving behind the composed surface of Helena Whitmore's professional expression. The legal team, she said. What's their read? On the underlying compliance issue, they need more time. The pattern BrooksShield identified is complex, and the review is going to take weeks. He paused. On our position more broadly, their initial read is that our strongest posture is full cooperation with the review process. Any appearance of obstruction would compound the situation significantly. And the banks, the 7. Our relationship teams are in contact. The mood is... He paused, choosing his word carefully cautious. These are institutions that have existing long-standing relationships with BrooksShield. They trust the reporting. They're taking it seriously. Another pause. One of them, Heartland Federal in Columbus, their CEO put it to our relationship manager this way. We've been working with Daniel Brooks for 6 years. If his system flagged something, we're reviewing it. That's not negotiable. Helena absorbed this. His system. Not the report. Not the data. Not even BrooksShield's system. His system. 6 words that contained an entire world of information about the nature of what Daniel Brooks had built. Not a product. Not a service. Not a vendor relationship managed through contracts and renewal cycles. A trust relationship. Personal. Durable. The kind built over years of 2 a.m. phone calls and reduced fees and showing up when it wasn't required and doing the right thing when nobody would have known if you hadn't. Helena sat very still for a long time. Get me his number, she said finally. Warren blinked. Daniel Brooks. Yes. Helena, our legal team has recommended that any communication with... I'm not calling him about the compliance matter, she said. Our legal team can relax. She paused. I'm calling him because... She stopped. Started again. I'm calling him because I owe him a phone call. Warren looked at her for a moment. Something in her voice was different. Not softer exactly, but different. As though something that had been under high pressure had not exploded, but shifted, rearranged itself into a different configuration. I'll find the number, he said. He was almost at the door when Helena said quietly, almost to herself, so quietly that Warren wasn't entirely sure she meant for him to hear it. I didn't even read the document he put in front of me. Warren stopped. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything. He opened the door and walked out. And behind him, Helena Whitmore, CEO cover story. Billion-dollar empire woman who had never once in her professional life been told something she hadn't found a way to reframe in her own favor, sat alone at her desk with the November light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city spread out below her, and the file on Daniel Brooks open on her desk, and she read every word of it. Every word. Starting with the story about the client who had called him at 3 a.m, and the fees he had reduced without being asked, and the testimony from the CEO in Des Moines who had used the word trustworthy and meant it in a way that Helena was only just beginning to understand she had never been described. She read it all. And the city outside her windows went on with its indifferent, enormous Tuesday afternoon and the BrooksShield servers hummed quietly on the west side of Chicago and in a classroom on the south side of the city. Amara Brooks was doing her afternoon reading, unaware that the world her father had quietly built around her, not of money, not of power, not of the performance of importance, was doing exactly what he had always designed it to do. Protecting people who needed protecting, one careful documented 91% confident truth at a time. Daniel's phone rang at 7:52, Wednesday morning. He was standing at the kitchen counter making Amara's lunch turkey sandwich apple slices the small bag of pretzels she liked, and the phone was face up on the counter, and he saw the number before he saw the name his contact list had attached to it. It was a 312 number, Chicago, but not a number he recognized. He let it ring twice while he finished wrapping the sandwich. Then he picked up. Daniel Brooks. The pause on the other end lasted almost 4 seconds. Long enough that Daniel moved the phone slightly from his ear to confirm the call was still connected. It was. Mr. Brooks. The voice was controlled, professional. And underneath the control, something that sounded like it had cost something to keep that controlled. This is Helena Whitmore. Daniel set down the apple he was about to slice. I was quiet for a moment. Not from surprise, he had half expected this call in the abstract way you expect things that follow logically from a sequence of events you've been watching unfold. But expectation and the actual experience of a thing are different, and he needed a second to move from one to the other. Ms. Whitmore, he said. I want to be clear, she said, that this call has nothing to do with the compliance matter. My legal team is handling that through the appropriate channels, and I'm not going to discuss it. A breath. This is a different conversation, if you're willing to have it. I'm listening, Daniel said. Another pause. Shorter this time, but with a different quality. Not hesitation, but the specific beat of someone who has prepared what they want to say, and is now discovering at the moment of saying it, that preparation and execution are not the same thing. I owe you an apology, Helena said. The kitchen was quiet. Amara was still in her room getting dressed. Outside the window, the city was doing its usual morning thing, indifferent and relentless. I owe you a direct, unqualified apology for the way I spoke to you in that meeting on Monday. Helena continued. The way I assessed you before you had said 10 words. The things I said about your preparation, your daughter, your... She stopped. I was condescending, I was dismissive, and I was wrong. Daniel picked the apple back up, held it, didn't slice it yet. I appreciate that, he said. I don't want your appreciation, she said, and there was a sharpness in it, not directed at him. He understood, but at herself, the sharpness of someone who finds comfort in precision and is applying it to an uncomfortable truth. I want you to know that I'm saying it because it's true, not because of the situation with the compliance reports. I want to be very clear about that. Are you sure you can separate those two things? Daniel asked. Not unkindly. The pause this time was longer. No, she said. Honestly, no. I don't know if I can fully separate them. I've been thinking about that since yesterday. Another beat. But I know that what I said to you on Monday was wrong before any of this happened. And I know that if none of this had happened, if your system had found nothing, if those 7 banks had never received those reports, I would still owe you that apology. The same apology, word for word. Daniel thought about that. He thought about his mother in the kitchen on South Halsted, stirring whatever was on the stove. He thought about Amara's question in the break room. Are you sad? He thought about the 11 years between the first night he sat down in front of a second-hand server rack with an idea, and the Wednesday morning he was standing in his kitchen holding an apple while Helena Whitmore apologized to him on the phone. I accept your apology, he said. He could hear her exhale on the other end of the line. Thank you, she said. But I want to ask you something. Go ahead. In that boardroom, Daniel said, you had 8 executives in the room. Some of them looked uncomfortable when you were talking to me, but none of them said anything. He paused. Is that normal? In your company? That when someone is being treated the way I was treated, nobody speaks. The silence on Helena's end of the line was a different kind of silence than any of the ones that had come before it in the conversation. It was the silence of someone confronting a question they had not prepared for, because the question was aimed not at a specific incident, but at something systemic, something ambient, something that had accumulated in the atmosphere of a place over years, the way certain things accumulate that nobody notices until someone names them directly. "I don't know," Helena said, and she said it with a flatness that Daniel recognized as the specific sound of honesty arriving without packaging. "I genuinely don't know, and I think that's probably its own answer." "It probably is," Daniel said. Amara appeared in this kitchen doorway in her school uniform backpack, already on barrette, already in place. She looked at her father on the phone and read his face with the efficiency she had described on the bus 2 days ago, and she mouthed, "Is that her?" Daniel nodded once. Amara's eyes widened slightly. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and waited with the preternatural patience of a child who understood that some moments required stillness, even when everything in you wanted to move. "Mr. Brooks," Helena said, "I don't know what the compliance review is going to find. I want to be honest with you about that. I don't know what happened in those transaction accounts over the past 8 months, and I don't know whether what your system identified represents what the pattern suggests, or whether there's an explanation that the review will surface." She paused. "But I know that regardless of what that review finds, there's a problem in this company that your system didn't create. A problem that existed before Monday and that I'm responsible for." "What kind of problem?" Daniel asked. "The kind," she said carefully, "where someone like me can walk into a boardroom and take one look at someone like you and decide in 90 seconds that I already know everything I need to know." Another pause. "And where an entire room full of experienced professionals watches that happen and says nothing, because they've learned that saying something has costs they're not willing to pay." Daniel was quiet. "I've been that room," Helena said. "For 9 years. I built that room, not intentionally, not as a policy, but it's the room I built, and I didn't know it until—" She stopped. "Until yesterday," Daniel said. "Until you put a document in front of me and I didn't pick it up," she said. "And now I can't stop thinking about what was in it." Daniel looked at Amara across the kitchen table. She was watching him with those wide brown eyes, and he saw in her face something that he thought was probably a mirror of his own expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but the particular complicated stillness of someone watching a human being try imperfectly and publicly to reckon with a truth they had been avoiding. $840 million, Daniel said. "That's what was in it. That's how much fraud our system prevented for your correspondent banking partners in the last 24 months. He paused. "Not for you. For the customers of those banks. Ordinary people. People with savings accounts and small business loans and mortgage payments." He let that sit for a moment. "That's what I came to that meeting to talk about." Helena didn't say anything for a long moment. "I know," she said finally. "I know that now." "Okay," Daniel said. He picked up the apple and started slicing it. "I'd like to meet with you again," Helena said. "Properly. When the compliance situation is resolved and the legal teams have done whatever they need to do. I'd like to sit down and have the conversation we should have had on Monday." "I'm open to that," Daniel said. "And Mr. Brooks." She stopped, and he heard something in the stop, a quality in the way she arrested the sentence that felt deliberate, like a person making a choice in real time about how honest to be. "What you said when you left. That I hadn't made an offer, that I'd made an assessment." "I remember," Daniel said. "You were right," she said. "I want you to know that I know you were right." Daniel put the apple slices in the small container, snapped the lid on, and tucked it into Amara's lunchbox. "I'll talk to you when this is resolved," he said. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Whitmore." He hung up. Amara was looking at him. "Well," she said. She apologized. Was it real? Daniel thought about the pauses in Helena's voice. The specific flatness of "I genuinely don't know." The way she'd said "I built that room" with the tone of someone who had just understood something about a house they'd been living in for years without examining the architecture. "Yeah," he said. "I think it was real." Amara considered this with her usual morning gravity. "Good," she said. She picked up her lunchbox. "Daddy." "Yeah, you're not going to do anything bad to her company, right? Like try to make it worse?" Daniel looked at his daughter. No, he said. That's not what we do. Good, she said again. And she walked toward the front door, and Daniel grabbed his keys, and they went to school. The compliance review moved faster than anyone had predicted. This was in part because BrooksShield's documentation was exceptional. Patricia Osei had spent 11 years building reporting systems that were designed not just to flag anomalies, but to construct around each flag a complete evidentiary architecture, the transaction data, the pattern analysis, the confidence modeling, the regulatory cross-references that allowed external reviewers to understand precisely what the system had found and precisely why it had found it troubling. There was no ambiguity. There were no gaps in the chain of documented logic. There was simply the data arranged in the most transparent and navigable format Patricia could construct, with Daniel's direct contact information at the bottom of every page. The 7 compliance officers who received Patricia's initial reports escalated immediately. Their escalations triggered parallel reviews at 3 regulatory bodies. The reviews moved simultaneously rather than sequentially because the 7 banks' legal teams independently and without coordination all arrived at the same conclusion that the pattern BrooksShield had identified was significant enough and documented thoroughly enough that the cost of slow-walking the review was greater than the cost of moving fast. In 12 years of financial compliance work, Robert Finch at Heartland Federal had never seen 7 separate institutions move in the same direction at the same speed without someone coordinating them. He called Daniel on Thursday afternoon. "Your documentation," he said. "Daniel, I've been in compliance for 12 years. I have never seen reporting this clean." "Patricia built it," Daniel said. "She's been refining the format for 7 years. I want to hire her. She'd turn you down." "I know," Robert said. "I'm going to offer anyway." A pause. "The review is moving, faster than I expected. The other 6 banks are all in the same position. The documentation is so complete that there's almost nothing to reconstruct. Everything is just there." Another pause. "Daniel, what's the protocol on your end when the review is complete and findings are issued?" "We document the outcome, update the client files, and if the review finds that our flag was accurate, we revise our ongoing monitoring parameters for any entities connected to the flagged activity. And if the review finds you were wrong, we document that too," Daniel said. "And we do a full internal review of the algorithm that generated the flag to understand what created the false positive." "How many times has that happened?" "The internal review 7 times in 11 years. And how many of those 7 turned out to be actual false positives?" Daniel paused. "None," he said. "In each case, the review found that the flag was accurate and had been resolved before the external review was complete." Robert Finch was quiet for a moment. "Daniel," he said, "I need you to understand something. When those reports came in Tuesday morning, I didn't hesitate. Not for 1 second. I know your track record. I know what BrooksShield's flags mean. And I knew that whatever was in those reports was real." He paused. "That's 11 years of trust. You built that over 11 years." "I know," Daniel said. "Not everybody knows what they've built," Robert said. "I want to make sure you do." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said again, and this time it was different, quieter, and more complete. By Friday, word had spread, not through press releases, not through deliberate channels of any kind. The financial compliance world was paradoxically both secretive and intimate. It kept its specific details rigorously private while sharing its general intelligence with astonishing speed through the network of professional relationships that its practitioners maintained across institutional lines. Compliance officers talked to other compliance officers. Risk managers talked to risk managers. The information that moved through these conversations was not specific. Nobody was violating confidentiality, but the shape of it was unmistakable to anyone fluent in the language. Something significant had happened. A major financial entity had been flagged. The flag had come from a security provider whose reporting was spotless. 7 banks were in simultaneous review. The machinery of regulatory oversight was moving. And the name attached to the flag was BrooksShield Technologies. Daniel Brooks. By Friday afternoon, Daniel had received 14 phone calls from banking contacts outside the 7 directly involved institutions. Not asking about the specifics everybody understood, those were off limits. Just checking in, reconnecting. The financial industry equivalent of the way people appear in your doorway when they've heard something happened and they want you to know they're there. Marcus Webb, tracking the calls from his desk, put his head into Daniel's office at 3:30, Friday afternoon. 14 calls, he said. I know, Daniel said. From people who aren't involved in the review. I know. That's not nothing, Daniel. I know, Marcus. Marcus leaned against the doorframe. He had the look he got when he was processing something that he wanted to say carefully. Can I tell you what I keep thinking about? Go ahead. That woman sat across from you Monday morning and decided you weren't worth taking seriously, Marcus said. She looked at your suit and your folder and your daughter and she made a call. And she made it in a room full of people who let her make it. He paused. And then 48 hours later, 42 institutions that trust you more than most of them trust their own internal systems started responding to a report that you didn't even have to send. We were obligated to send it, Daniel said. I know. That's exactly the point. Marcus pushed off the doorframe. You built a machine that tells the truth whether you want it to or not. You built it that way on purpose, because that's who you are. He paused. And that machine just did something that no amount of money and no amount of power and no amount of tailored suits could do. He let the pause stretch out. She tried to make you feel small, and her own banking network responded to your report in 48 hours. Daniel looked at his operations director. At the man who had been with him since the second bedroom of a 2-bedroom apartment, who had helped him carry server equipment up 3 flights of stairs at midnight, who had sat with him through the first client call and the first contract and the first 2 a.m. crisis call, and every one of the 14,000 mornings that had accumulated between then and now. I don't want this to be about her, Daniel said quietly. I know, Marcus said. I mean that. The compliance report that had nothing to do with Monday morning. Patricia would have flagged it the same way if Helena Whitmore had been the most respectful person I've ever met. I know that too, Marcus said. I'm not saying what happened is about revenge. I'm saying... He paused, looking for the right words. I'm saying that sometimes the way the world responds to someone is information about who that person actually is. And I think you should let yourself take that in. Daniel looked at his desk. At the folder he had carried into the Whitmore Capital boardroom on Monday morning. It was sitting in the corner of his desk where he'd set it when he came back that afternoon. He hadn't moved it. He looked at it now and thought about what it contained, the numbers, the documentation, the careful architecture of what BrooksShield had built, and what it had accomplished, and what it continued quietly and without fanfare to do every single day. She didn't pick it up, he said. I know. She had it right there, and she didn't pick it up. I know, Daniel. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she called me Wednesday morning. Marcus straightened. What? She apologized. She was... He thought about the pauses in her voice, the specific flatness of the honest moments. She was trying to be genuine. I think she actually was. He paused. She said she built a room where people watch someone get treated badly and stay quiet, because speaking up has costs they're not willing to pay. Marcus absorbed this. That's a hard thing to say about yourself, he said finally. Yes, Daniel said. It is. You believe her. I believe she meant it when she said it, Daniel said carefully. Whether meaning it is the same as changing, that's a different question. That takes longer to answer. Marcus nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something more, and then decided not to. He pushed off the doorframe and went back to his desk. Daniel sat alone in his office and looked at the folder in the corner of his desk. I thought about what Robert Finch had said on Thursday. Not everybody knows what they've built. I want to make sure you do. He thought about the 14 phone calls. He thought about Patricia sending 7 emails at 6:43 on a Tuesday evening, and the first response arriving in 11 minutes. He thought about his aunt's $3,000. I thought about the kid he had been at 24, sitting in front of a second-hand server rack, angry at systems that protected wealth instead of people. He thought about what the system had done this week. Not for him. For 42 banking institutions and their millions of customers who would never know his name. For 7 compliance officers who had opened their emails Tuesday morning and found documentation so complete, so honest, and so precisely constructed that they had not had to guess at what was true. For every ordinary family who had a savings account at a bank whose infrastructure now ran a little safer because of what BrooksShield had flagged. He had not built this for recognition, but sitting alone in his office on a Friday afternoon, he allowed himself carefully, quietly, without performance, to know what he had built. The formal findings of the compliance review were issued on the following Tuesday, 8 days after Patricia had sent the initial reports. Daniel read them with Patricia in the server room, the same server room where she had first shown him the network diagram a week earlier. The room was the same. The hum was the same. Even the positions they were sitting in were almost identical. The findings were 23 pages long. Daniel read every word. Patricia had already read them twice. The review confirmed BrooksShield's flag. The pattern identified across the 7 correspondent banking relationships was as described in the initial report, a structured series of transaction flows that obscured origin and destination through layering techniques across multiple institutional relationships. The review found that the activity as documented constituted grounds for escalation to federal regulatory bodies. 3 separate agencies were now involved. The investigation was ongoing. For Whitmore Capital Group, the practical consequences were immediate and significant. 14 correspondent banking relationships were suspended pending the investigation. 2 major investment partnerships announced temporary pauses in their activity. Helena's board convened an emergency session. Her name appeared in financial news outlets, not as the genius of the cover stories, but in the specific careful language of institutional crisis, under review cooperation with authorities' commitment to transparency. The empire hadn't fallen, but it was shaking. Daniel closed the report. Patricia was watching him. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "This is what the system is supposed to do," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "This is exactly what the system is supposed to do." She nodded once in the way that Patricia nodded when she had decided a matter was settled and could now be filed. "I've been getting requests," she said, "from 3 institutions that are not currently BrooksShield clients. They saw the reporting. They want to talk about onboarding." Daniel looked at her. "Who?" She named them. 2 were mid-sized regional banks. The third was a larger institution, the kind that 6 months ago would not have taken a meeting with BrooksShield, because BrooksShield was in the language Helena had used the week before regional. "Tell them we'll schedule calls," Daniel said. Patricia made a note, already looking back at her screens. "Patricia," Daniel said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for flagging it the right way, for not letting what happened Monday color the reporting." Patricia Osei looked at him with the expression she reserved for statements that she found unnecessary to confirm, because the alternative was so obviously not in her nature as to require no address. "Daniel," she said, "I have never in my professional life done anything any other way." "I know," he said. "I know that." He paused. "I just wanted to say it out loud." She almost smiled. "You said that last time too," she said. "Still true." He walked out of the server room and through the office past Marcus at his desk and the 2 junior analysts working at the far end of the room, and he got his jacket from the hook by the door and walked outside into the sharp November air and called his daughter's school to confirm he would be there for pickup at 3:15. The secretary confirmed he was on the list as always. He put his phone in his pocket. He stood on the sidewalk outside the office, and the city moved around him the way it always did, without acknowledgement, without pause, full of its own immense and indifferent momentum, and Daniel Brooks stood in the middle of it and was still. How was still the way he had learned to be still. Not passively, not resignedly, but the specific stillness of a person who had spent 11 years building something true, and now had the strange clarifying experience of watching that truth move through the world on its own, doing the work he had designed it to do, carrying the weight of the trust he had built into every line of its architecture. He hadn't needed a 41st floor. He hadn't needed a tailored suit. He hadn't needed the kind of credibility that announced itself in lobbies designed to make visitors feel small. He had needed to build something true, and to be the kind of person who other people trusted with the truth. That was all. That was it. Turned out enough. He walked to the bus stop and took the bus south to pick up his daughter. Helena Whitmore sat alone in her office at the end of that same Tuesday. The board meeting had run until 7 p.m. Her legal team was still on the floor below her, their lights still on their voices, still moving through documents she had already read 3 times. Her communications director had drafted 4 different versions of a statement. Her CFO had run 17 different scenario models for the investigation's possible outcomes. Every person who worked for her was working. She sat very still at her desk. On the desk in front of her was a single sheet of paper. She had printed it herself from the file Warren had compiled. It was not a financial document. It was not a legal analysis. It was 1 paragraph, a testimonial from the CEO of First Consolidated in Des Moines. A sentence that she had read so many times in the past 6 days that she could have recited it without looking. The most trustworthy vendor relationship I've had in 30 years of banking. She read it again. Then she set the paper down. She thought about the boardroom on Monday, about the laugh, about the word professional arriving like a verdict, about the document Daniel Brooks had set in front of her with his careful hands, and then just as carefully picked back up. She thought about what she had said to him. "You don't belong here," she had said that. She had said that to a man whose technology protected the financial futures of millions of ordinary Americans, whose fraud detection had saved his clients nearly $1 billion in 2 years, whose compliance reporting was so trusted, so complete, and so honest that 7 banking institutions had moved in the same direction at the same speed without coordination because they all independently trusted the source. She had said that to the most credible person in the room, and she had said it because of his suit. Helena Whitmore was not at her core a person without self-awareness. She was not a person who lacked the capacity for honest self-examination. The armor of her professional life, the confidence, the precision, the aggressive intelligence, the manner that rooms either loved or feared, that armor had served her well enough that she had rarely needed to look at what it was protecting, what it was perhaps preventing. She was looking at it now. The laugh. The look. The 90 seconds in which she had decided she already knew everything she needed to know about a man she had never met. She had been wrong about so many things. She had been wrong about his suit, wrong about the folder, wrong about what it meant to bring your daughter to a meeting, wrong about regional, wrong about limited, wrong about every single signifier she had used to construct her verdict. But the thing she had been most wrong about, the thing that sat with the most weight in the quiet of her office at the end of this terrible Tuesday, was something simpler than any of those. She had been wrong about what power looked like. She had spent her entire career believing that she knew what power looked like. She had built her understanding of it over 3 decades through school, through early career, through the aggressive and relentless climb to the position she now held, and she had built it based on the available evidence, on what she had been shown, on who was in the rooms that mattered, and what they wore, and how they carried themselves, and what buildings they worked in. She had built a very complete picture of what power looked like, and that picture had not included Daniel Brooks, not the South Side of Chicago, not the 6-year-old suit, not the daughter with the yellow beret sitting quietly in a conference room eating expensive cookies, while her father, with absolute calm, dismantled in 9 words. "You haven't made an offer. You've made an assessment." Everything Helena had believed about why she was in that room and who held the leverage. She picked up her phone. She opened the contact Warren had given her. She looked at Daniel Brooks's number, and then she put the phone back down. Not because she wasn't going to call. She was going to call. She had told him she would when the compliance matter was resolved, and she kept her word, and she was going to. But not tonight. Tonight she was going to sit with this. With the specific discomfort of having seen yourself clearly and not liked what you saw. With the understanding that an apology, however sincere, was not the end of something, but the beginning of the harder work of actually changing the room you had built, which meant first understanding every brick you had laid to build it. She had a lot of bricks to look at. She was going to start tonight. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago spread out below her in the November dark, lit and dense and indifferent. The same city where Daniel Brooks was at this moment, probably making his daughter's dinner, probably asking about her day, probably sitting across a kitchen table from an 8-year-old with her mother's eyes, and quietly building in the only way that things are actually built, something that no one could take from her. Helena looked at the city. She looked at the paragraph on her desk. She took a long, slow breath, and she started reading. 3 weeks passed. They passed the way. Consequential weeks always pass faster than they should, slower than you want, full of the ordinary details of living that continue regardless of whatever larger thing is happening around them. Daniel made lunches. He picked up Amara from school. He sat through parent-teacher conferences and grocery runs and the specific Tuesday evening ritual of helping Amara with a science project about the water cycle that required 3 poster boards, a bottle of blue food coloring, and more patience than either of them had initially budgeted for. The BrooksShield office moved through its own rhythms. Patricia managed the ongoing communication with the 7 banks' compliance teams. Marcus handled the 3 new institution inquiries that had come in after the review findings were published. 2 junior analysts were promoted. A 4th was hired. The servers hummed. The system watched. The work continued in the way work continues when it is built on something solid enough to sustain its own momentum. And in the background, the investigation into Whitmore Capital Group moved forward with the particular grinding patience of regulatory machinery. Not fast, not slow, but inevitable. In the way that things are inevitable when the documentation is complete and the pattern is clear, and the only remaining question is the precise shape of the consequence rather than whether one is coming. Daniel watched it the way he watched all the downstream effects of his system's work with attention, but without attachment. He had filed the reports. He had cooperated fully with every regulatory inquiry directed at BrooksShield. He had made Patricia available for 3 separate calls with investigators who wanted to understand the technical architecture of the flag that had initiated the review. He had done everything that his contracts required, everything that the law required, everything that his own conscience required, and then he had gone back to work. He was in a call with a community bank in rural Kentucky, a small institution that had been a client for 4 years, whose compliance officer was a 62-year-old woman named Marlene, who called Daniel every quarter just to talk through what she was seeing in their transaction environment when Warren Cross called for the 2nd time. He let it go to voicemail. Marlene was telling him about a pattern she'd noticed in some of their agricultural loan repayment timing that she wanted BrooksShield's system to look at more closely, and Daniel was listening. Actually listening. Not the way you listen when you're waiting for someone to finish, but the way you listen when what they're saying matters and you want to understand it when his phone buzzed again. Warren Cross. Again. Marlene, Daniel said. I need to call you back in 15 minutes. Can I do that? Of course, honey, Marlene said. She was the only person in the financial industry who called Daniel honey and meant it with the warmth of someone's grandmother, which it turned out she was. You take care of what you need to take care of. He called Warren back. She wants to meet, Warren said without preamble. In person, this week if you're available. I told her I was open to meeting when the compliance matter was resolved, Daniel said. The federal investigation is ongoing, Warren said. It won't be fully resolved for months, possibly longer. But Helena, she's not asking about the investigation. She wants to separate those conversations. She wants to meet with you about something else. What's something else? Warren paused. I think she should tell you that herself. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Through his office window, he could see Marcus at his desk talking on his own phone, making the specific hand gesture he made when he was explaining something technical to someone who was trying to understand it, and almost there. Thursday, Daniel said. 2 o'clock, but not at Whitmore Capital. Where then? Daniel thought for a moment. There's a place on Michigan Avenue, Brennan's, you know it. I'll find it. 2 o'clock Thursday, Daniel said. Just her, not a room full of executives. Understood, Warren said. I'll let her know. Daniel hung up and called Marlene back, and they spent 22 minutes talking about agricultural loan timing patterns, and Daniel took 3 pages of notes and promised to have Patricia run a custom analysis by end of week. He meant it. He would do it. He always did what he said he would do. This was not a performance. It was just who he was. Brennan's was a restaurant that Daniel had been going to for 6 years. Not because it was expensive, it was reasonably priced. The kind of place where business people came for lunch and stayed for conversation. But because the owner, a retired firefighter named Gene Brennan, who had opened the restaurant at 58 because he wanted to spend his remaining working years feeding people rather than rescuing them, had a policy that Daniel respected deeply. The policy was simple. Everybody who walked in the door got treated the same. Not the same service. Gene read people well enough to give each customer what they actually needed, which varied. But the same fundamental dignity, the same quality of attention, the same assumption that you were worth his time. Daniel had seen Gene extend this policy to a homeless man who wandered in from the cold one January morning and sat down at the counter and asked if he could have a cup of coffee. Gene had given him coffee and a sandwich. And when another customer, a man in an expensive coat, who had clearly decided the homeless man's presence was an affront to his morning, had complained, Gene had told him quietly, and without particular drama, that if the coffee and sandwich bothered him, he was welcome to take his business elsewhere. The man in the expensive coat had left. Daniel had been at a corner table watching this happen. He had left Gene a tip that was larger than his bill. He arrived at Brennan's at 1:45 Thursday afternoon. Gene saw him come in, gave the small nod of recognition that Gene gave his regulars, and showed him to the corner table that Daniel preferred. There was coffee waiting. Gene had remembered across 6 years of visits that Daniel took it black. Helena arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. She came alone, as he had asked. She was dressed differently than she had been in the boardroom, not less professionally, but differently. The armor was still there in her posture, in the precision of her appearance, but there was something less performative about it. Less constructed for the purpose of establishing hierarchy before a word was spoken. She looked like a person who was arriving at a conversation rather than a presentation. She saw Daniel, walked to the table, sat down. Gene appeared, took her order. She asked for coffee. Black, and Gene noted this without comment and disappeared. Helena looked at Daniel across the table. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," he said. For a moment they were both quiet. Not uncomfortably, or maybe uncomfortably, but honestly so. The discomfort of two people who have both been carrying something since the last time they were in the same room and are now deciding how to set it down. "Before anything else," Helena said, "I want to say the apology again, in person, because the phone call was..." She paused. "It was what I had, but it wasn't enough, and I need you to hear it directly." "Okay," Daniel said. "What I said to you in that boardroom was wrong," Helena said. Not wrong as in professionally inappropriate, which it also was, but wrong as in fundamentally wrong about who you are and what you'd built and what your presence in that room represented. She held his gaze steadily. "I looked at you, and I made a decision in about 60 seconds, based on things that had nothing to do with who you actually are. And I said things to your face in front of other people, in front of your daughter, that no person should have to hear." She paused. "I'm sorry, Daniel. Genuinely. Not because of the investigation, not because of what your system found. Because it was wrong, and I knew better, and I didn't do better." Daniel listened to this. He let it land completely before he responded. "I hear you," he said. "And I meant what I said on the phone. I accept it." "I don't want you to just accept it," Helena said. I want you to know that it changed something. In me. Not just about how I treat people in rooms, though that too, but something deeper than that." She picked up her coffee, set it back down. "I've been running a company for 9 years. I've made a lot of decisions. I've built something significant, and I'm not going to apologize for being good at my job, because I am good at my job. But somewhere in building it, I built something else too. Something in the culture of the place that I didn't intend and didn't notice, and apparently nobody around me was willing to tell me about. The room that stays quiet, Daniel said. Yes, she said. The room that stays quiet. She looked at him. Your question. On the phone. About whether that was normal, whether people in my company watched things happen and said nothing because speaking up had costs. She paused. I've been sitting with that for 3 weeks, and the answer I've arrived at is that yes, it's normal. It's the norm. And it became the norm because I made it the norm without realizing I was making it. Daniel was quiet for a moment. How? He asked. She blinked slightly, not surprised by the question, but perhaps by the directness of it. What do you mean? How did you make it the norm? What did you do or not do that built that culture? Helena looked at him steadily. You're asking me to diagnose myself. You came to this meeting for a reason, Daniel said. I'm guessing it wasn't just to apologize again. So tell me what you're actually here to talk about. She looked at him for a long moment. And then something shifted in her expression, the specific shift of a person who has been carrying a carefully constructed version of a conversation in their head for 3 weeks and has just realized that the actual conversation is going to be different and better and more demanding. I want to rebuild the culture, she said, of Whitmore Capital. I want to change fundamentally, change the way we operate internally, the way we assess people, the way we make room for people to speak when something is wrong. She paused. And I want to know if there's any version of a conversation where you'd be willing to help me do that. The corner table at Brennan's was quiet for a moment. Daniel looked at Helena Whitmore. He looked at her the way he had learned to look at people over 11 years of building trust relationships in an industry that wasn't always trustworthy, not for what they were presenting, but for what was underneath the presentation. For the specific quality of the thing they were asking. Why me? He said. Because you're the most credible person I've encountered in 9 years of this work, she said. Because your track record is spotless in ways mine currently is not. Because the people who know you describe you in language that I have never heard used to describe me. She paused. And because you walked out of my boardroom with your dignity completely intact. And I've been thinking about that every day since it happened. She looked directly at him. You didn't need to fight me. You didn't need to prove anything. You just closed your folder and picked up your daughter's hand and left. She paused. What I've been trying to understand is how a person gets to that place, where they don't need the room to validate them, where they're completely fine leaving. Daniel thought about this for a long moment. My wife died 3 years ago, he said. Helena was quiet. Breast cancer. She was 33. He said it simply without self-pity, in the way you say things that have been true for long enough that you have made your peace with them. Not a comfortable peace. Not a peace without grief, but a peace. Her name was Cecilia. She was a 3rd-grade teacher. She was the funniest person I've ever known. And the most honest. He picked up his coffee, held it. When she died, Amara was 5. And I spent about 6 months being, I don't know what the right word is. Not destroyed, but close to it. He paused. And then one morning, Amara came into the kitchen and she looked at me and she said, Daddy, are we going to be okay? And she was 5 years old and she needed an answer. He set the coffee down. I didn't know if we were going to be okay. I didn't know anything except that she needed to hear something true from me. Not reassurance, not performance. Something true. He paused. So I said, I don't know yet, but I'm going to do everything I can, and that's a promise. Helena was watching him, and that's when I understood something, Daniel continued, about what kind of person I needed to be. Not for success, not for the company, for her. He paused. She's watching me. She has been since the day her mother died. She watches everything I do, and she's learning from it. And I decided that what I wanted her to learn from me was not how to perform strength in rooms that are designed to make you feel small. He paused again. I wanted her to learn how to be so clear about what you are and what you've built that no room can define you by what it refuses to see. Helena was very still. That's why I could leave the room, Daniel said. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew what I'd built. I didn't need her to tell me. The restaurant moved around them, the quiet lunch hour traffic of other tables, Jean refilling someone's water, the ambient sound of a space designed for conversation, and Helena sat with what Daniel had just said, in the particular way that people sit with things that have landed in a place they didn't expect. "Cecilia," she said. "Yes." "I'm sorry," Helena said. And she meant it. Daniel could hear that she meant it with the specific weight of someone who has just understood something about the man across from her that reorganizes everything she thought she already understood about him. "Thank you," Daniel said simply. They were quiet for a moment. Then Daniel said, "Tell me what you actually want to build, at Whitmore Capital. What does it look like when it's done?" Helena looked at him, and for the next 90 minutes, they talked. Not about the investigation, not about the compliance review, not about the 17 correspondent banking relationships, or the federal regulatory inquiry, or the 4 press statements Helena's communications team had drafted and redrafted. They talked about culture, about what it means to build an institution that tells the truth about what it sees, about the specific mechanisms by which a room learns to stay quiet when something is wrong, not through any single policy or decision, but through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments in which speaking cost more than staying silent until silence became the natural gravity of the place. Helena talked about her own history in ways that Daniel suspected she rarely talked about it. She talked about building Whitmore Capital from a 2-person operation at 23, about the specific survival strategies she had developed as a young woman in an industry that had been designed by and for people who did not look like her, about the armor she had built, and the price it had extracted, and the way that armor had eventually become so integrated into her professional identity that she had stopped being able to distinguish between the person wearing it and the protection it provided. "I stopped being afraid a long time ago," she said. "And when I stopped being afraid, I stopped being able to see the people who still were." Daniel listened to this carefully. "The executives in that room on Monday," he said. "The ones who went quiet. Do they know why they went quiet?" "I've talked to 3 of them since," she said. "Since Monday." She paused. 2 of them said they didn't say anything because they've seen what happens to people who push back in my meetings. One of them, she stopped. "What?" "One of them said he tried. He said he started to say something and then looked at me and stopped." She was quiet for a moment. "He said the look on my face told him it would cost him." "And he was probably right," Daniel said. Not unkindly. "I was probably right," she agreed. "So you're not starting from scratch," Daniel said. "You're starting from damage. That's harder." "I know. And the investigation doesn't help," he said. "Because everyone who might have been willing to trust the process of change is also watching to see whether the company survives what's coming. I know that too. So why should they believe you're serious?" Daniel asked. "What's different about this versus every other cultural initiative that a company announces after a crisis and then quietly abandons when the crisis passes?" Helena looked at him steadily. "Because I'm sitting here talking to you," she said. "In a restaurant you chose. Without my executives, without my lawyers, without any of the architecture of power that I normally carry into rooms." She paused. "And because I'm asking you, the man I humiliated in front of 8 people 2 weeks ago, to help me. Not as a transaction, not as a PR strategy. Because I actually don't know how to do what I'm trying to do, and you do, and I need help." Daniel considered this. "That's honest," he said. "I'm trying to be." "The change you're describing," he said slowly, "doesn't start with a program. It doesn't start with an initiative or a workshop or a cultural assessment. It starts with you doing something different in the next meeting, and the meeting after that, and the meeting after that." He paused. "It starts with one person in one room deciding that the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of speaking. And that has to be you first, before anyone else will believe it's safe." "I know," she said. "Do you?" he said. "Because knowing it and doing it are, I need you to understand that the gap between those 2 things is where most change efforts die. People understand the concept. They agree with the principle. And then they walk into the next meeting, and the old gravity takes over, and they make the familiar choice, because the familiar choice is easier." He paused. "The only way through that gap is reps. Hundreds of them. And they're uncomfortable every single time." Helena was quiet for a long moment. How do you do it? She asked. Stay consistent. Stay who you are across everything. The meetings that go wrong. The clients who underestimate you. Monday. Daniel thought about this seriously. Amara, he said. Partly. He paused. But also, I've been doing this long enough that I've seen what inconsistency costs. I've watched people build things and then make the one expedient choice that they thought they could get away with, and watched how that one choice spread, like a crack in a foundation. He paused again. The trust I've built with the banks, with Robert Finch, with Marlene in Kentucky, with every single client, that trust is not a product I sell. It's the compound interest of every time I did what I said I would do. Every time I told the truth when a comfortable version was available. He held her gaze. The value of BrooksShield is not our algorithm, Helena. Our algorithm is very good, but the reason 42 banks sent their compliance teams to review our report in 48 hours without questioning the source is because of who I am to them. Not what the company is. Who I am. That's not scalable, Helena said. You know that. No, Daniel agreed. It's not. That's the hardest part of growth. Teaching other people to carry what you carry. He paused. That's what I'm working on right now. It's the most difficult thing I've done since starting the company. He looked at her. It's also the most important. Helena sat with this. Outside Brennan's the afternoon moved. The lunch hour traffic had thinned. Jean was cleaning the counter at the far end of the room with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had made peace with the pace of his work. I want to propose something, Helena said. Go ahead. After the investigation is resolved, however it resolves, I want to explore a partnership. Not an acquisition. A genuine partnership on terms that make sense for BrooksShield and for what you've built. She paused. And I want to work with you on the cultural rebuild at Whitmore Capital. Not as a paid consultant, as I don't know what the right word is. An honest collaborator. Someone who tells me the truth when I need to hear it. She paused. Because apparently I need someone in my orbit who is capable of that and willing to do it. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. That's a significant thing to ask, he said. I know. You're asking me to trust you after 3 weeks. I'm asking you to consider it, she said. I'm not asking you to decide today. Daniel nodded slowly. There are conditions, he said. Tell me. The partnership, if we get there, has to be structured in a way that doesn't compromise BrooksShield's independence. Our compliance reporting answers to our clients and to the law, not to any partner. That's not negotiable, ever. Understood, she said. The cultural work, I am not a consultant. I don't do workshops, and I don't write reports that get filed. If I'm involved in real conversations with real people in real rooms, and I'm going to tell you things you may not want to hear, and I'm going to expect you to do something about them. That's what I need, she said. And third, Daniel said. He paused, looked at her carefully. One of the executives in that room on Monday. The one who said he started to say something and stopped. I want him to have the chance to finish the sentence, in a setting where it's actually safe. Helena blinked. What do you mean? I mean that the room you built taught him to stop. The room you're building has to teach him to finish. And the way you do that is you create a moment, a real one, not a performance where he sees that finishing has different consequences than stopping. He paused. That's where it starts, not with a policy, with one person in one room discovering that the gravity has changed. Helena looked at Daniel Brooks across the table for a long, quiet moment, and what she felt she would tell Warren later, choosing her words with the care she was increasingly applying to her own internal accounting. What she felt was not admiration exactly, though admiration was part of it. It was something more specific than that. It was the feeling of being in the presence of someone who had built their values so deeply into the structure of their daily life that there was no gap between the principles they espoused and the way they existed in the world. No performance, no variance, just consistency, all the way down. She had spent her career trying to be impressive. She was very good at impressive. She had never understood until this moment how completely different impressive was from trustworthy. Okay, she said. Okay to all three, Daniel said. Okay to all three. Jean appeared at the table, with the unhurried timing of someone who had been watching the conversation the way experienced restaurateurs watch conversations, not intrusively, but attentively, ready for the moment when the shift happened and the people at the table were ready for something. "Can I get you anything else?" he asked. Helena looked at Daniel. "Do you want to keep talking?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I do." Daniel looked at Jean. "2 more coffees," he said. "And whatever the soup is today." "Split pea," Jean said. "That works." Jean disappeared, and Daniel and Helena kept talking. He told Marcus about the meeting that evening, sitting in Marcus's office at the end of the day, with the office quiet around them and the city going dark outside the windows. Marcus listened to everything without interrupting, which was the way Marcus listened when something was complicated enough to require it. "She's serious," Daniel said. "I think." "You think," Marcus said. "I'm not certain. I can't be certain this early, but the conversation—" He paused, looking for the right frame. "It wasn't a performance. She knows the difference between performing accountability and actually doing it, and she was working hard to do the second thing." He paused. "She's going to make mistakes, old habits in high-stress moments. She's going to revert sometimes. That's how change works." "What did she say about the investigation?" Marcus asked. "Nothing. We didn't touch it." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "You spent 3 hours together and didn't discuss the thing that's in every financial news outlet in the country." "There was nothing to say about it that isn't already being handled by the appropriate people," Daniel said. "That's not what the conversation was for." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "You like her," he said. "I don't know her well enough to like her," Daniel said. "But I think there's something real underneath the armor. And I think she's in enough pain right now to be willing to look at it." "And you think that's enough to build something on?" Daniel thought about this seriously. "I think it's a beginning," he said. "Beginnings are always uncertain. That doesn't make them not worth having." Marcus leaned back in his chair. He had the look he got when he was doing the final calculation on something, the last step of a long equation, checking the work before committing to the answer. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "That document you put in front of her in the boardroom. The one she didn't pick up." "She's read it now," Marcus said. "She has," Daniel confirmed. "All of it." "I think so, yes." Marcus nodded slowly. $840 million, he said. "In 2 years. For ordinary people." He paused. "That's what was in the document she didn't pick up." "Yes," Daniel said. "And now she's sitting in Brennan's asking how to build something better than what she built." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "There's something in that," he said. "About what actually changes people. It's never the argument. It's never the perfectly constructed case." He paused. "It's seeing clearly and unavoidably the cost of who you've been." Daniel looked at his operations director. "You sound like my mother," he said. "Your mother was a very smart woman," Marcus said. "Yes," Daniel said. "She was." He stood up, put his jacket on, picked up his phone and his keys. "You going to get Amara?" Marcus asked. "She's at a sleepover tonight. First one she's had since September." He paused. "I'm going to go home and sit with the quiet for a while." "You hate quiet," Marcus said. "I'm working on it," Daniel said. He walked to the door, stopped, turned back. "Marcus, the 3 new client inquiries. I'll send you the summaries tomorrow. Don't rush them," Daniel said. "I want to do the introductory calls myself, all 3. Marcus looked at him. "That's going to take most of next week." "I know," Daniel said. "These are the first conversations. They matter." He paused. "They always matter." He walked out, and the office settled into its after-hours quiet, and the servers hummed their constant hum, and Marcus sat at his desk for a while longer, looking at the door Daniel had walked out of, thinking about something Daniel had said in the meeting 3 weeks ago that he had never quite stopped thinking about. "I built a machine that tells the truth whether you want it to or not." He thought about that for a long time. Then he gathered his things, turned off his lamp, and went home. That night, alone in his apartment, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel sat on the couch where he had fallen asleep 3 weeks ago with his phone on his chest. The apartment was quiet. He sat with it. He thought about Cecilia. He thought about her the way he always thought about her at the end of significant days, not with the acute grief of the early years, but with the specific and irreplaceable ache of someone whose presence has become part of the architecture of how you see everything, even and especially after they are gone. I thought about what she would say about all of this. About the boardroom and the compliance report and the 3 hours at Brennan's and what was being built on the other side of it. He thought she would probably say, "You already know what to do. You always do. Stop overthinking it and do it." And then she would probably steal the last of his coffee. He smiled. Alone in the quiet apartment with the city outside his window, he smiled. He picked up his phone and texted Amara at her sleepover, "Good night, bug. Hope you're having fun." 3 minutes later, a single emoji came back. A yellow star. He set the phone down. He sat with the quiet. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the quiet felt like exactly what it was. Not an absence, but a space. Full of everything that had happened, and everything that was coming, and the vast, unhurried possibility of what could be built carefully, honestly, in the time that remained. He closed his eyes. He wasn't worried. He never really was. 6 months later, Daniel Brooks walked into a room full of strangers who already knew his name, not because of a press release, not because of a marketing campaign or a speaking engagement or any of the deliberate machinery by which people in his industry manufactured visibility. They knew his name the way people know the names of things that have quietly held something important together. The way you learn the name of the engineer who designed the bridge. You cross every morning only after you understand what would happen if the bridge weren't there. The room was a conference hall in downtown Chicago, and the occasion was the Midwest Regional Banking Summit, an annual gathering that Daniel had attended 5 times as a vendor, twice as a panelist, and never before as a keynote speaker. The invitation had come in January, 3 months after the Whitmore Capital story had moved through the financial press and settled into the particular layer of industry consciousness where significant events live after the news cycle has moved on, but the meaning hasn't. He had said yes because Marcus had told him to, and Patricia had agreed with Marcus, and Amara had said with the directness of a 9-year-old who had inherited her father's clarity about what mattered. "Daddy, if you have something worth saying, you should say it where people can hear it." He had thought about that for 2 days and then called the conference organizer back. He stood backstage now in the 45 seconds before he walked out, and he did what he always did in the 45 seconds before something significant. He thought about Cecilia, not with sadness. With the particular kind of love that survives grief intact, the love that becomes a compass rather than a wound. He thought about what she would say. He thought about her third graders and the way she used to describe teaching them. You give them something true to hold on to, and then you get out of the way and let them hold it. And he thought about how that was in the end not so different from what he had spent 11 years trying to do. He walked out. The applause was immediate and genuine, the kind that comes from rooms full of people who have been waiting for something they couldn't quite articulate until it arrived. He walked to the podium. He looked out at 400 faces: compliance officers, bank executives, risk managers, technology directors, the full spectrum of the regional banking world. And he did not feel small. He never felt small anymore. He wasn't sure he ever really had. "I want to tell you something true," he said without preamble, without the usual choreography of thank yous and acknowledgments. "Something I've learned over 11 years of building a company in the spaces where other companies weren't looking." The room was quiet. "Trust," he said, "is not a feature. It is not a product differentiator. It is not a line item in a marketing strategy." He paused. "Trust is the only thing you are actually building. Everything else, the technology, the contracts, the client relationships, the revenue, all of it is downstream of that one thing. And if you get that one thing right consistently over years, the rest takes care of itself in ways that will surprise you." He paused. "And if you get it wrong, even once, even in a room where you think nobody important is watching, the cost is everything you built it on top of." He didn't look at Helena when he said this. She was in the third row sitting between Warren Cross and one of her board members, and he was aware of her presence. The way you are aware of certain people in rooms, not obtrusively, but completely. And he did not look at her. Not because he was avoiding it. Because what he was saying was not about her. It had never been about her. She happened to be the most recent example of a truth that predated their acquaintance by 11 years. He talked for 40 minutes. He talked about his aunt's $3,000. He talked about the second-hand server rack and the two-bedroom apartment and the first cold call to a community bank in Rockford, Illinois, whose compliance officer had listened to his entire pitch and then said, "Come in and show me what it does." He talked about the 2 a.m. phone calls and the reduced fees and the 18 months of patient relationship building that preceded every single signed contract, because he had understood early that the signature was not the relationship. The relationship was the relationship, and the signature was just the moment when it became official. He talked about Patricia and Marcus, and the room laughed at his Marcus impression, which he had not planned, but which arrived naturally when he was describing the moment Marcus had told him about the 14 phone calls from banking contacts checking in after the Whitmore situation. He talked about Amara. Briefly, carefully, with the specific restraint of a parent who knows his child's story is not entirely his to tell. He said only that he had a daughter who watched everything he did, and that this had clarified his choices in ways he had not anticipated and could not adequately explain. And that if there was a single most important reason he had built BrooksShield the way he built it, it was because he wanted her to see what it looked like to do the right thing when the wrong thing was easier, and nobody would have known the difference. "The compliance report we filed 6 months ago," he said. "I've been asked about this in about 30 different contexts since November. Whether it was strategic, whether it was personal, whether there was something specific about the timing." He paused. "The answer is no to all three. Our system found a pattern. Our contract required us to report it. Patricia Osei sent 7 emails at 6:43 on a Tuesday evening. That's the entire story." He paused. The lesson in that story, if there is one, is not about what happens when you expose wrongdoing. It's about what happens when your system is so trustworthy, and your relationships are so solid, and your track record is so clean, that when you report something, 7 compliance officers respond in 48 hours without questioning the source. He let that sit. That doesn't happen because of technology. It happens because of 11 years of 2 a.m. phone calls, after the applause, after the handshakes, and the business cards, and the 3 conversations with banking executives who wanted to talk seriously about BrooksShield. Daniel found a quiet corner near the back of the hall and stood there for a moment, just breathing. Robert Finch appeared at his shoulder. "Marlene's watching the live stream in Kentucky," Robert said. "She texted me to tell you that was the best 40 minutes she's spent in a long time." Daniel laughed. "Tell her I'll call her Friday about those agricultural loan patterns." Robert said. "She told me to remind you anyway." He paused. "You did good up there." "I said what was true," Daniel said. "That's what doing good looks like," Robert said. He clapped Daniel once on the shoulder and moved back into the crowd. And then Helena was there. She had waited, which Daniel noticed. She had not been among the first group, had not inserted herself into the immediate aftermath of the speech with the executive momentum. That was, he had come to understand over 6 months, her default mode and the thing she was working hardest to change. She had waited until the crowd thinned, until the moment felt like a choice rather than a performance. "That was remarkable," she said. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said. "I wasn't going to miss it." She paused. "The part about trust being the only thing you're actually building. I've been thinking about that since I got your outline last week." 3 weeks ago, at Daniel's suggestion, Helena had begun sending him a weekly 3-paragraph summary of one thing she had done differently in her company that week. Not accomplishments, not victories, just one thing. A moment in which she had made a different choice than the old gravity would have pulled her toward. He read them carefully and responded briefly, usually with a question. Last week's summary had been about a meeting in which one of her executives, the same executive who had told her he started to say something on the Monday and stopped, had pushed back on a decision she had already made. Publicly. In front of the room. And instead of doing what she would have done 9 months ago, which was to manage the challenge with the smooth, cold efficiency of someone who had learned to make dissent feel like a tactical error. She had stopped. She had asked him to explain his reasoning. She had listened to the full explanation. And at the end she had said, "You're right, let's revisit this." 3 words. Let's revisit this. And the room had gone very quiet in an entirely different way than Helena Whitmore's rooms usually went quiet. She had written about it in her 3 paragraphs with the specific understatedness of someone who understood that what had happened was significant without knowing exactly how to characterize the significance. Daniel had written back 1 sentence. That's where it starts. "How's the rebuild going?" he asked her now. "Slowly," she said. "Which you told me it would. And with backsliding, which you also told me." She paused. "Last Tuesday I caught myself doing the voice." "The voice," Daniel said. "The voice I use when someone says something I've already decided is wrong before they finish saying it." She said it without self-pity, with the directness of someone who has learned to name things accurately, because naming them accurately is the first step to changing them. One of the junior analysts was in a meeting presenting a risk model, and I felt myself starting to, I could hear it in my own register, the slight drop in temperature. She paused. I stopped. I asked her to continue, and the model was actually very good. "What did you do after the meeting?" "I went to her office and told her the model was strong." Helena paused. "And I told her I almost talked over her before she finished." Daniel looked at her. "You told her that?" "Yes." "How did that land?" "She looked at me like I had grown a second head," Helena said. "And then she said, 'Thank you, Ms. Whitmore.' And I said, 'Helena.' And she said, 'Thank you, Helena.' And then I left before either of us said anything else because I figured that was enough for one afternoon." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed. A real laugh, full and genuine, the laugh of someone who has just been surprised by a story in the best possible way. Helena looked slightly startled, as though she had not expected the laugh. And then slowly she smiled too. "That's good," Daniel said. "That's genuinely good." "It felt ridiculous," she said. "Most important things do at first," he said. "That's how you know they're important. The easy things don't change anything." She nodded, looked at him steadily. "The partnership proposal," she said. "Warren has the revised framework on your desk. I want you to know that the independence clause is exactly what you asked for. Unchanged, non-negotiable, built into the foundational document, so it can't be modified without mutual consent." "I saw it this morning," Daniel said. "Patricia's reviewed it. I'll have her comments to Warren by end of week." "Take your time," Helena said. "I will," he said. She nodded once in the way she had developed over 6 months of different kinds of meetings, a nod that was not dismissal, but completion, the gesture of someone who has learned that not every silence needs to be filled. "Daniel," she said before she turned to go. "Yes." "The document you put in front of me," she said. "In the boardroom. I've read it probably 15 times since November." He looked at her. $840 million, she said. "For people who will never know your name." She paused. "I think about that a lot. About what it means to build something that protects people who don't know they're being protected." She paused again. "I think that's the thing I understood least about you when we met, and the thing I've had to work hardest to understand since." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "My aunt lost $3,000 when I was 24, he said. It was everything she had saved. And the bank system didn't catch the fraud because the system wasn't built to protect people like her. It was built to protect the institution." He paused. "So I built something different." Helena looked at him. "Yes," she said softly. "You did." She left, and Daniel stood in the quiet corner of the conference hall and watched the room continue around him and thought about his aunt and her $3,000 and the second-hand server rack and the 42 nodes on Patricia's network diagram and the yellow beret and the bus ride home and the apple slices in Amara's lunchbox and the specific sound a folder makes when you close it carefully in a room that expected you to stay. He thought about all of it, and he was at peace with all of it. Chasheng. He picked Amara up from school that afternoon. She came out of the building with her backpack and her lunchbox and the specific energy of a child at the end of a school day, slightly depleted, slightly wired, full of things that had happened that she hadn't yet decided which ones were worth telling. She found him at the usual spot by the fence. She looked at his face. "How was the speech?" she said. "It went well," he said. "How was school?" "Fine." She fell into step beside him. "Did people like it?" "I think so." "Did you say the part about Grandma Brooks?" "No." "You should have said the part about Grandma Brooks." "Maybe next time," he said. She accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had learned that her father's decisions were usually deliberate and rarely worth arguing with. They walked for half a block in comfortable silence. "Daddy?" "Yeah. At school today in social studies, we talked about what makes someone a leader." She said this with the particular seriousness she reserved for things that had genuinely engaged her. The seriousness that reminded Daniel every time he saw it of exactly who she was going to become. And Mrs. Patterson asked everyone to name a leader they admired. "What did you say?" Amara was quiet for a step or two. "I said you," she said, simply, without drama, without the self-consciousness of a child trying to say the right thing. Just the truth stated the way she stated all truths. Daniel stopped walking. Amara stopped too and looked up at him. "What did Mrs. Patterson say?" he asked. "She said, 'Tell me why.'" Amara paused. "And I said, because you built something that protects people who don't know they're being protected. And because when someone tried to make you feel small, you just picked up your stuff and left, and you weren't even angry." She paused again. "And because when I ask you if I look okay, you always tell me the truth." Daniel looked at his daughter. He thought about Cecilia. He thought about the question she had asked at 5 years old, standing in the kitchen. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" He thought about the answer he had given. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to do everything I can. And that's a promise." He crouched down, so he was at her level, right there on the sidewalk, with the city moving around them, and the afternoon light coming in sideways through the buildings. And he looked at Amara. Brooks, 9 years old, yellow beret, her mother's eyes, his mother's stubbornness, and something entirely her own that was still becoming itself and would be remarkable when it was done, and he felt the full weight of everything he had built, pressing gently against the inside of his chest. Not the technology, not the 42 clients, not the conference speech or the partnership framework or the compliance reports. This was what he had built. "You always look okay," he said. She rolled her eyes. "I know, you always say that. Because it's always true." She let him stand back up, and then she took his hand. The way she had taken his hand, walking into the Whitmore Capitol building 6 months ago, and they walked toward the bus stop together, and the city moved around them with its usual indifference, and Daniel Brooks held his daughter's hand and did not need anything else from the world. The formal partnership between BrooksShield Technologies and Whitmore Capital Group was announced 4 months later on a Thursday morning in early spring. The press coverage was significant. Financial news outlets covered it as a story about institutional accountability and the reshaping of industry culture. Technology publications focused on BrooksShield's expansion trajectory. A few writers tried to frame it as a redemption narrative, the CEO who had been humbled and the founder who had risen, and Daniel declined every interview request that used either of those words because that wasn't the story, and he wasn't interested in telling a story that wasn't true. The true story was simpler and harder and less cinematic than that. The true story was that a woman had looked at a man and decided in 60 seconds that she knew everything worth knowing about him, and she had been wrong in every possible direction, and the consequences of that wrongness had been significant enough to force her to look at herself in a way she had been avoiding for years. And she had looked, and she had not turned away from what she saw, and she had started slowly and imperfectly, and with regular backsliding to change. And the man she had underestimated had done what he always did, continued steadily and without drama to be exactly who he had always been. That was the true story. It wasn't a redemption arc. It was a reckoning, and a beginning, and the kind of slow, unglamorous, consequential work that actually changes things. At the partnership announcement, Daniel stood at a podium for the second time in 4 months and said something short. "BrooksShield has always been built on one principle," he said. "That the right thing to do and the profitable thing to do are not opposites. They are in the long run the same thing. This partnership is built on that same principle. And if it ever stops being built on that principle, the partnership ends. That's in the documents. And it's in this room. And now it's in the record." He stepped back from the podium. Helena, standing to his left, did not look surprised by this. She had read the documents. She had been in the room. She had helped put it in the record. She nodded once. And then she stepped to the podium and said her own short piece, which was also for Helena Whitmore. A first short, honest and free of the architecture of impressiveness that had characterized her public communications for 9 years. "I'm going to say something that my communications team advised me not to say," she said. "They said it was too specific, too personal, too much like an admission." She paused. "6 months ago, I sat across a table from Daniel Brooks, and I decided before he had finished his first sentence that I already knew everything I needed to know about him. I was wrong. I was wrong about the suit. I was wrong about the folder. I was wrong about what it meant that he brought his daughter." She paused. "And I was most wrong about the thing that is hardest to say out loud. I was wrong to think that the way a person presents themselves is the same as who they are." She stopped. "I'm trying to build a company where that mistake is harder to make. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying. And Daniel Brooks, who would have been entirely within his rights to have no interest in this conversation, has been honest enough to help me try." She paused one final time. "I wanted to say that out loud, in front of people, because it happened out loud in front of people. And the only appropriate response to a public wrong is a public reckoning." She stepped back. The room was quiet for a moment. And then it wasn't. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Amara doing homework. She had a book report Friday on a biography she had chosen herself. She had picked Harriet Tubman with characteristic Amara decisiveness and absolutely no interest in Daniel's gentle suggestion that she might also consider some other options. "What are you writing about?" he asked. "About how she didn't wait for permission," Amara said, not looking up. Daniel smiled. "Good angle," he said. "Mrs. Patterson says the best leaders know that asking permission and doing what's right aren't always the same thing." "Mrs. Patterson is correct." "I know," Amara said. "I told her you say the same thing." He looked at his daughter, bent over her paper, her yellow barrette catching the kitchen light, her hand moving across the page with the specific concentration of someone who had something true to say and was working on finding the right words for it. He looked at her for a moment longer than she knew he was looking in the way. Parents look at their children when the children are occupied, and the parents are overcome briefly and completely by the specific love that has no adequate language. Then he got up and started making dinner. The city hummed outside the window. The BrooksShield servers hummed in an office across town. 42 banking institutions across 11 states ran their Monday evening operations through infrastructure that included quietly and without announcement the fraud detection architecture that Daniel Brooks had built in the second bedroom of a 2-bedroom apartment when he was 24 years old, and angry at systems that protected wealth instead of people. The system watched. The system learned. The system protected. And the man who built it stood in his kitchen making pasta for his 9-year-old daughter, and the question she had asked him at 5 years old, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" had an answer now. Not the uncertain, honest, provisional answer he had given her then. A different answer. The kind that comes not from knowing the future, but from understanding completely and without qualification what you have built and who you are and what those two things taken together can withstand. They were going to be okay. They had always been going to be okay. Not because of the 42 banks. Not because of the partnership announcement or the conference speech or the 6 months of consequential reckonings that had followed a Monday morning when a woman in a tailored suit laughed at a man who had arrived to tell her the truth. Because of who he was. Because of what he had built. Because of the promise he had made to a 5-year-old in a kitchen on a morning when the world had reduced itself to the size of one child's question and one parent's answer, and he had chosen quietly, completely, and without reservation to mean every word. That was the foundation. That had always been the foundation. And nothing, not a boardroom, not a laugh, not the accumulated weight of every room that had ever decided it already knew everything worth knowing about Daniel Brooks before he finished his first sentence, nothing had ever touched it. Nothing ever would.